Eve is a little different to most MMORPGs. While it's common in the genre to have zones designed to funnel you into certain areas at different points of progression, New Eden has no such topography. However, it does give the impression of a similar design at first to the untrained eye. When you create an account, you start in Highsec. That part is non-negotiable. It doesn't matter if you already have an area of space in mind that you most want to engage with, you're going to have to get there from Highsec. Specifically, your character will be created in a starter system. It would be easy, knowing only this information, to assume that New Eden's Kisogo, Todaki, and Amson are no different to Azeroth's Elwyn Forest, Durotar, or Teldrassil. But this is a misunderstanding that catches out a lot of seasoned MMO players who get started in EVE Online. Unlike a lot of theme park MMOs, you're not going to get a choreographed starter environment with prominent quest givers and a lot of hints about not straying too far from your starter zone for now. Instead, there's absolutely nothing keeping you from, as I'm sure many of you with alts have done in the past, undocking from your starter system station and making a beeline directly to a station all the way out on the fringes of Nullsec. There are some unique rules specific to those starter systems. Specifically, it is against the rules to abuse new players' lack of knowledge in the game, and that goes all the way from in-space griefing like ganking a new player's Corvette, to contract or ISK-related scams that would normally be the bread and butter of a trade hub like Jita. It's definitely a more gentle request than many others in EVE's otherwise fairly limited rule set, and I strongly suspect CCP would give you a sternly worded letter and a fair few warnings before actually taking any action, but honestly at that point, good riddance. Interestingly, and this one's new even to me with something like 10,000 hours played, you're meant to refrain from griefing players with 30 days or less in game in systems associated with the Sisters of Eve epic arc, including Heck. So I think that one's definitely fallen by the wayside. It doesn't help the confusion for experienced MMO players that EVE is more or less designed as a series of concentric circles, ignoring the weird triangle bit and wormhole space, which confusingly also kind of resides within this map, but that's a whole other can of worms. This concentric nature might give the feeling that you're intended to progress from Highsec to Lowsec to Nullsec, but as people were for some reason all too eager to point out in my The Problem with Lowsec video, that is not the case. In fact, some would, definitely not without bias, argue that if there were to be a progression, it wouldn't even be in that order. The simple fact of the matter is that certain areas of space will suit different people, depending on what they most enjoy mechanically, socially, or strategically. So naturally, the next question will be, which area of space should I try? Which is exactly why I'm making this video. But before I start, I want to be clear to existing players of EVE that I'm absolutely aware I'm going to be making some very sweeping generalizations here. There's going to be a lot of moments where you could actually me, but bear with me here because while it's great that the EVE community is so full of so many specialized experts of their space, what I think it really lacks is broad strokes, mostly unbiased general knowledge for new bros. So that's the hole we're going to be trying to fill. Where possible, I'm going to try and avoid giving ISK per hour numbers or anything concrete like that. I know it sounds like a really useful figure on paper, but in practice it's so much less useful than it seems. People have a bad habit of not including prep time or wind down time in their ISK per hour calculations, so I guarantee any number I give, I'll have comments packed with different numbers people have and apples to oranges comparisons that will give new players the wrong idea about what's actually worth doing. I'm also not going to touch on Pochvan at all. I know it doesn't really fit into any of the other areas of space and therefore deserves its own classification, but I also think it deserves its own video, preferably by someone who knows way more about it than me, since it's the one area of EVE I've probably engaged with the least. Highsec, Lowsec, and Nullsec all have a very similar ratting situation. The actual sites available will vary between each of those spaces, and the specific empire of rats will differ depending on the region. This is important to keep in mind because the preferred E-war of that region's rats can have a major impact on the preferred strategy for running those sites, as well as the loot table and therefore ISK per hour you can receive for doing them. In Highsec, your basic combat anomalies range from hideaways to dens. In Lowsec, they range from hideaways to hubs, with the absence of burrows for some reason, and then in Nullsec they range from hidden dens to the very top of the combat site difficulty tiers, the Forsaken Sanctum. While on paper these are sites with ascending difficulty, implying a progression between the regions like we talked about before, in practice it's not always like doing the highest option in the list is better. As the difficulty of the rats in the site increase, it's not necessarily a linear increase in reward. So there are many sites where the increased clear time is not well compensated and therefore lower tier sites are preferred. I recommend checking with other pilots in your corporation or alliance once you've joined one for tips on ratting in your local area, as there's lots of different approaches that will vary depending on EWAR and damage types. What might surprise a lot of new players is that the barrier to entry for ratting across these different spaces isn't really that high or that different. There are sites in Highsec and Lowsec that will only require a cruiser to complete, and even in some of the higher tier Nullsec sites, a cruiser will still be your preferred choice. Similar to the non-linearity of difficulty with the sites, there exists in EVE a non-linearity of performance for ships. Cruisers fit in this perfect spot where they can put out solid amounts of DPS and tank for good raw damage, but are small and nimble enough to negate a considerable amount of that damage before it even hits the ship, through speed and signature tanking. Drone boats are also a pretty consistent favourite for anomalies in these spaces owing to the low input APM requirements. This means you can sit back and relax with something on the second monitor while you grind ISK ratting. The low APM also makes it a highly scalable activity, meaning that if you are someone interested in multi-boxing, it's viable to run many accounts in tandem, since drone auto-aggroing makes it so that some sites only require input at the start and finish of their 15 to 20 minute duration. Beyond combat anomalies, there are also combat signatures. These are sites you have to scan down in order for them to appear on your probe scanner, but can contribute significantly to your income if you get familiar with those that spawn in your local area. What I personally like to do is have a few ships in my home station hangar, specifically designed to tackle my local combat signatures in the fastest or most fun way. Often this gives a nice rare opportunity for variety in how you tackle the sites, rather than the very common drone boat spinning. Much like anomalies, which signatures are available does depend on what area of space you're in, but this is another circumstance of non-linearity. There are Lowsec sites that I run in a hook bill where my average pickup is 150 to 200 million ISK, and Nullsec sites that require a battleship where my average is under 50 million. In the unrated complexes list, Highsec has a range from hideouts to vigils, Lowsec ranges from hideouts to annexes, and Nullsec ranges from bases to fleet staging points. DED complexes that come from combat signature scanning are much more varied depending on region. There's a tiering and rating list of them on the EVE University wiki, but I'm not going to go through them because their names, actual difficulties, and how they function vary completely between each faction. Just another one of those cases where it's probably best if you talk to other ratting players in your corporation or alliance. Escalations, technically called expeditions, but I don't know anyone that calls them that, are unique to each area of space. But as a type of DED complex, the apparent linearity in difficulty will not necessarily translate to a linearity in income. What they can affect though is which combat sites you grind, since not all sites can escalate into every escalation. You'll probably find out that there's a specific site in your area that ratters prefer to run, even though on paper it makes less money than the other options, because of the greater frequency at which it escalates to a more profitable escalation site. By and large, ratting content does step up between Highsec, Lowsec, and Nullsec, but I will add that the gap between sovereign or player-owned Nullsec and Lowsec is much bigger than the gap between Lowsec and Highsec. You see, Lowsec and Highsec are both still technically owned by their local empires, so the sites that spawn are just a factor of CCP's random spawning mechanics. There are some theories into how that works, which some seem fairly verifiable, but I won't go into those for now. Sovereign Nullsec, on the other hand, has Sov hubs, which allow the owning player alliance to customize the sites that are going to spawn in that system. That's what creates the biggest ISK gap. For a couple of years I lived in a constellation in Lowsec where if one determined player woke up before everyone else, it would be very possible to run every combat site in the constellation before anyone else got a chance, and probably deny anyone that activity for at least the rest of the day. I'm aware there's some work with the CSM right now to try and improve the ratting situation in Highsec and Lowsec because of that difference in how sites spawn, but I guess I'll have to wait until the next time I live in either of those spaces to fully realize the benefits. Incursions barely even count in the same category as what comes to most people's mind when I say ratting, but that is essentially nonetheless what it is. Incursions are probably the closest thing that EVE Online has to raiding, being group PvE content seen as a kind of endgame for ratting. Incursions are so notoriously profitable that it's become a bit of a meme when anyone talks about what they do to make ISK to just ask them why they aren't spending that time running incursions. Due to the size of fleets required to run the content and the organizational puzzle that presents, there exists many different independent and unaligned groups running incursions in Highsec and Lowsec with pilots from any and all alliances, so you can live in pretty much any non-wormhole space and enjoy this content. but to get involved in Nullsec incursions, it's usually going to be necessary to be part of the alliance that owns the space within which the incursion has spawned, so a bit of a crapshoot really. Wormhole ratting bucks the trend of other spaces' ratting options significantly. Lacking the traditional pirate-occupied regional layout of K-Space, it's instead occupied by sleeper rats. Difficulty varies not by nature of being in a wormhole, but depends on which classification of wormhole it's in. Honestly, in my brief experience occupying a wormhole here and there, I have to say it does feel like the PvE in wormholes is considerably better documented than K-Space, so there are some great websites out there to find out the best sites to run and what to run them with, no matter which class of wormhole you're residing in. The range of different ships for running wormhole sites does pretty much run the full gamut of ship classifications, with lower class combat sites being laughably easy for even a mediocre destroyer fit, and higher class combat sites seeing the likes of marauders and dreadnoughts. Despite the wide range in difficulty, wormhole ratting is surprisingly approachable in my experience, with relatively easy to run fits so long as you don't try to get ahead of yourself. There is, however, considerably more preparation and monitoring required for ratting in a wormhole. I'm not going to talk about rolling holes and watching D-scan, but safe to say if you only have maybe half an hour a day to play EVE, then a lot of wormhole content is going to take you longer to get set up for than you have time to play. So if you're able to play for a few hours at a time and you enjoy some varied content with different strategies required to complete the site, then it doesn't really matter which area of space you choose. You'll find something like that everywhere. If, however, you're no-lifing this game, no shame there, trust me, I have a 5-digit number of hours in this game now, then Nullsec is probably the clear winner for you, as the ability to chain together sites uninterrupted is hard to parallel anywhere else. CCP has made a lot of changes to mining content over the past few years, and there have historically been similar major overhauls to the distribution of minerals in the past. For that reason, if you haven't played EVE in a few years at least, this will probably be new information to you. Similarly, if you're watching this video a few years after it was uploaded, this section definitely needs some asterisks. Unlike ratting content, where the gap between sovereign Nullsec and Lowsec is much bigger than the gap between Lowsec and Highsec, Nullsec and Lowsec actually sit on relatively even playing fields with mining. It's Highsec that is comparatively left much further behind. It's better to understand mining across New Eden less in the context of the specific ores available in those spaces, and more in the minerals that those ores produce when reprocessed. Both Nullsec and Lowsec enjoys plentiful supplies of pyrite, mexilon, isogen, and noxium, while Nullsec enjoys morphite, zydrine, tritanium, and megasite, which Lowsec cannot access. Highsec, on the other hand, has tritanium, pyrite, and mexilon in great supply, and the occasional source of isogen. CCP has, for better or worse, been applying a lot of band-aid solutions to influence supply and demand of different minerals, especially during the inflation caused by isogen over the last couple of years. So what was originally quite simple content is now admittedly quite complicated. You have your regular asteroid belts, ore anomalies in your probe scanner, mining escalation sites that are similar to ratting escalation sites, and phased rifts that contain prismaticite. I guess a lot of this will fall down to your personal preference, but as much as I like variety in my gameplay, it is insane how what seems like one activity is split into so many different categories that take up completely different places in the UI. If there are any new bros watching this, let me know if you think it was a little overcomplicated when you started learning how to mine. If you want to get involved in industry, the important thing for me to mention now is that this is not RuneScape Iron Man mode. If you actually want to get into industry in this game, you're going to be buying most of the stuff you need, and there are far bigger reasons to be in a certain area of space than what ore spawns there. But there's a whole different section for that coming later in the video. So don't make your decision based on procurement, this only matters if you actually want to be the one doing the mining. Very similar to ratting, Nullsec offers a level of safety when mining that's extremely difficult to compete with. The very existence of sino-jamming, capital umbrellas, and bubbles allows the space to see the pinnacle of mining in a way that other space struggles to compete with. While on paper you can raw coal mine anywhere you can get a capital ship, Nullsec is by far the most common place for raw coals to actually see use in mining. In case you haven't flown one before, you should know raw coals have insane tank. Take however much tank you think that the ship one step up from an Orca should have, then double it and double it again. They are truly formidable ships when flown with expertise and experience. Unfortunately though, there is always an N+1 way to beat this strength, and unless a raw coal can get back up, it will struggle to survive against a few capital ships or high DPS hard to track sub-capitals. Nullsec alliances can offer this backup in a way that not many other groups in the game can. There have been times where Lowsec rawcore mining was a bit more viable, and I'm sure there are a couple of Lowsec alliances who are still doing it here or there, but keep that in mind if rawcore mining is something on your to-do list. The catch with mining in Lowsec, Nullsec, or Wormholes is that you're very much a dream target for a hunter. Barges can pack a punch if fit correctly, but if you're out mining in a skiff getting half the yield so that you can potentially kill a single small ship that comes to kill you, please get some help. Escape is your best friend when mining in these spaces, and as such you need to be keeping an eye on the threats that surround you. In Nullsec and Lowsec this means local chat and intel channels, in Wormholes this means hull control and descan, and in Highsec this means knowing the ganking hotspots and usual suspects. I do have to emphasize at this stage though, if you want to mine in Highsec but you're terrified about ganking, I recommend speaking to your Corp or Alliance mates about it because I guarantee it's not as big of a threat as you think it is. I see a lot of people comment when I say something like this, telling me, no, every time I undock I get ganked, I can't even mine for 15 minutes without someone coming and ganking me, and trust me, you're doing something wrong if that's true. Ganking is very easy to avoid, it just usually requires a little knowledge of the local area and more than a bare minimum understanding of how to fit a ship. The benefit of Highsec mining, of course, is that you can pay considerably less attention to the game, as again, ganking is not that big of a problem, seriously. I used to get up and go to the store next door to my house while Highsec moon mining, and in about 2 years of doing that, never once had an issue. This kind of playstyle might suit players who aren't able to commit to longer, uninterrupted play sessions, or who are playing while working from home, for example. Speaking of moon mining, let's talk about it. Moon minerals follow a pretty strict linearity of value between the areas of space. Highsec only has R4 moons, those are the moon materials that look blue in your cargo. Lowsec and Nullsec have the higher value moon materials, but Nullsec has them at a considerably higher frequency. Moon mining, unlike minerals, requires either an orca or a rawcore to compress. For this reason, if you're into moon mining at all, I highly recommend either Nullsec or Highsec. Orcas perform just fine in Highsec, and as mentioned before, rawcores are perfectly suited to Nullsec. Lowsec gets left out of the active moon mining scene a lot, courtesy of the orca being too easy to catch and the rawcore being too easy to drop caps on. You can really see this in Eve's monthly economic report, where Lowsec moon mining is almost non-existent. For what it's worth, wormhole moons, for some reason that I'm not completely sure I agree with, have the same R4 moons as Highsec. So you get Highsec amounts of ISK with wormhole amounts of risk. Steer clear from wormholes if moon mining is on your to-do list. Nullsec enjoys the bulk of the valuable moon mining, once again courtesy of the safety in which rawcores can operate. Moon mining as a whole has unfortunately become significantly less profitable and common thanks to the automated Metanox moon drills added in the Equinox expansion. I will however resist going on another rant about these, as my distaste for them is very well documented in another video. Ice mining is very much not going to buck the trend we've been setting in this discussion either, I'm afraid. Highsec ice is, well, it's quite a weird phenomenon. For those who don't know, ice respawns at downtime and every 6 hours after the belt is completely cleared, always in the same systems. Because of this, it's quite easy to predict when and where an ice belt will respawn, so Highsec systems that have an ice belt usually have a little group of folks that hit it almost every day in their time zone. It's cool actually, you can have a little culture of fellow ice miners that you speak to at the same time every day. I used to really enjoy it personally, but just as those sites are predictable to mine, they can be predictable to gank. The chances are still a lot lower than some would have you believe, but if you're going to get Highsec ganked while mining, these systems present a significantly higher risk than most others. Lowsec ice is very prevalent and available, but that's thanks to ice having the exact same problems as moon ore. It requires an orca or rawcore to compress, neither of which perform very well in most Lowsec environments, so once again, give Lowsec a miss if you're looking to mine ice. Nullsec ice tends to enjoy the best of both worlds, being less competitive and more plentiful than Highsec ice, as well as including more valuable varieties. Something to keep in mind if you're interested in ice mining is that different geographical regions of the game create ice with different outputs of isotopes, regardless of the security level of that space. Those isotopes are used in fueling jump drives, so depending on the current capital ship meta, the price difference between each of those isotopes can be major. Wormholes once again insist on being different, and its unique and highly valuable ice is only found in shattered wormholes, a variety of wormholes in which you cannot anchor structures and in which it is therefore very difficult to reside. It's an interesting option for day tripping with expedition frigates, but not really something you can orient your playstyle around. It's something that should be on your EVE Online bucket list, but probably won't be something you want to seek out. So I spoke a bit earlier about not picking your industry location based on the local available materials. So let's talk about the things you should have in mind when picking where to do industry. First things first, ask yourself, do you want to make things from scratch using the base materials and working your way up for maximum vertical integration? If yes, do not do industry in Highsec. Reactions are a key part of advanced manufacturing, pretty much any tier 2 faction or capital, and those reactions cannot be done in Highsec. It's not uncommon to find free ports with minimal tax in Lowsec right on the border with Highsec, so this is an option if you're really desperate to make it work, but those systems tend to be risky to haul into and garner high system cost indexes as a result of everyone in Highsec taking a pilgrimage there for their reactions. Secondly, do you want to make capital ships? If yes, same answer, don't start doing industry in Highsec as you can't build them there. And of course, do you want to build super capital ships? If you do, your only option is Sovereign Nullsec, thanks to the SovHub upgrade required to make supercapital manufacturing possible. I hasten to add though that if you're at the stage of watching this video, your answer to those questions of whether or not you want to build capitals or supercapitals should probably be no. That's a big commitment to the late game of an already complicated playstyle that you should probably not be using as the criteria at this stage. There's nothing wrong with trying out even the most basic levels of industry in Highsec, just keep these criteria in mind when you decide it's something you want to commit to. If you get that far, I really recommend watching a video I did last year specifically about the common pitfalls new industrialists experience and how to avoid them. Besides these examples that specifically prevent certain types of industry being done in certain spaces, there is another factor involved. The manufacturing rigs used on industrial complexes, so that's Ritarus, Asbels and Sotios, benefit from a security bonus multiplier which you can see in the attributes tab for each rig. This multiplier is applied to the material reduction bonus on the same page and rewards manufacturing in Lowsec, Nullsec and Wormholes with lower input material costs than in Highsec. This is typically not going to be a difference between something being completely not worth making and being a mega money spinner, but if this is a playstyle you find yourself committed to and interested in, that bonus will definitely be adding up over time. The amount of ISK involved in late game industry is such that a couple of percentage point bonus can be in raw ISK terms pretty massive. What is important to note about these bonuses is that Wormhole space and Nullsec space are treated as the same, understandably, when applying the bonus. That does not mean that you should think of Wormhole and Nullsec as equivalent spaces when it comes to industrial gameplay. I'll go more into the general risks of Wormhole gameplay when I get to the asset safety section of the video, but industry in Wormholes has a very different set of values at play. For starters, import and export to and from a wormhole can be a logistical challenge in and of itself. It's considerably harder to set up a consistent logistics chain from your suppliers to your customers if where you are in known space changes so frequently. These challenges only become more complex the more you output too, as higher volume products will need bigger ships to haul them, putting more mass through the wormhole and causing it to collapse more often, moving you to another area of known space again. Industry in wormhole space is therefore much less often a calculation of raw profitability, and much more often a calculation of comparative cost. The question becomes whether it is cheaper and more convenient to produce an item in your wormhole, or purchase it from a trade hub and import it. There are plenty of exceptions out there, don't get me wrong, and if you're determined to pursue industry gameplay and live in a wormhole, there will be niches that you can make work, but this will definitely be more of a challenge than industry in known space. PI has to get an honourable mention. I hate that it's called Planetary Industry at all, because for a new player it sounds like this should be lumped in with the rest of the industry section, but Planetary Industry is no more industry related than mining or ratting, and honestly there's even an argument that it's less industry related than both of those things. All PI really entails is passively extracting materials from a planet. You can extract them raw, process them into higher value materials with more complex planetary setups, or go all the way to the highest tier of PI, which will require the collaborative planning of setups on multiple different planets. But this takes place entirely within a minigame which is pretty much solved, and with the introduction of PI templates, you can just copy someone else's setup to make the perfect set and forget income stream. Everyone can and probably should be doing this regardless of what other playstyles or interests they have, since it's a few hours of setup that never really expires and it's easier than ever to extract value from. It is worth mentioning though, since we're discussing the differences between these areas of space, that planetary industry yields are very different between them. Nullsec and Wormhole planets produce significantly more resources from the exact same setups and planet types that you'll see in Highsec. When you see people talking about Planetary Industry numbers that are absolutely nowhere near the numbers you are seeing in Highsec, that's probably because they're doing their PI in a wormhole or in Nullsec. Lowsec planets are slightly better than Highsec, but they definitely sit closer to the Highsec side of things than the Nullsec and wormhole side. Areas of space also massively dictate the POCO situation. If you're not familiar with POCOs, they are player-owned customs offices. When you warp to most planets in EVE, you will see one of these, or in Nullsec you might see a skyhook instead, which despite having additional functionality also does the same thing as a POCO. The owner of the customs office can set different tax rates depending on the owning corp's standings with other groups in EVE. For example, you could decide that anyone set to +10 gets 0% tax, anyone set to +5 gets 10% tax, and anyone set to neutral gets 20% tax. You can come up with your own numbers, but these are just an example. In Nullsec and Wormholes, because of the free PvP nature of the space, it's quite common that your corp or alliance will own some or all of the local customs offices. If not, you'll probably know and have a diplomatic relationship with the people that do. For that reason, you'll be expecting fairly preferable tax rates. In Lowsec and Highsec, however, because of the more fluid concept of ownership and ease of access for almost any group in the game, the customs office situation is a lot more like a cartel. A shadow cartel to be more specific, but that's a whole other discussion that I've already done once before about the state of Metanox drills in Lowsec. There are a few groups that are highly invested in and specialized at defending these customs offices, and claiming back customs offices not being well defended by their existing owners. You can therefore expect a considerably less favorable tax rate, and that will have a knock-on effect on the kind of ISK you can make through this passive income method. The markets in EVE Online, in their behaviour and in their location, are a completely player-controlled phenomenon. There's not really anything preventing the current market environment from being flipped on its head, but there are some pretty consistent truths that don't look likely to change anytime soon. The most obvious being that the biggest trade hub in the game, Jita, is in Highsec. It's for this reason that the Highsec population remains so high regardless of where you might live in New Eden. Organised alliances are capable of extraordinary feats of industry, but ultimately pretty much everyone will interact with Jita no matter where in the galaxy they live. For some that will be directly, for others it will be through middleman importers and industrialists, but it would be hard to imagine much of the EVE economy without it. Living near Jita, or the considerably smaller but still substantial Amar trade hub, is not strictly necessary, but it sure can be convenient. The unanimity of these locations means that if you're already joining an established group in EVE, you can bet they already have some means of importing and exporting to the major trade hubs. That's where the secret lies, honestly, economies of scale. The jump freighter route to your station on the edges of Nullsec may be arduous from Jita's hustle and bustle, but efficiently grouped up with the cargo of others, it can be inexpensive and convenient to buy and sell there despite the physical distance. Far from the only trade hub though, most large Nullsec groups and even many Lowsec groups will have a de facto local trade hub, usually in a player-owned structure. Transactions are often encouraged there as it keeps the ISK flowing between local players rather than to fester in the wallets of Jita's tycoons, or often potentially funding the wealth of your adversaries. There's also typically a small tax levied on transactions in that structure, less than that which is charged by the NPCs in stations like Jita and Amar, but instead of being an ISK sink with that money disappearing from the economy, it goes into the wallet of the alliance that owns the player-owned structure. The wormhole situation for markets is quite similar to the state of industry in wormholes. It's much more concerned with what is worth importing and exporting versus keeping within the whole. You'll find considerably more local person-to-person contract trading in wormhole life, as the inefficiency of one player exporting something to market while another in the same corporation imports that same item is a lot more impactful than it would be anywhere else in New Eden. If you're at the stage of your EVE journey where you're wondering where in New Eden to play, there's a good chance you're not fully familiar with asset safety. To summarize it quickly, despite the cutthroat reputation of EVE, there are many safeguards in place designed to minimize the chances that you'll get fully reset back to absolutely broke with nothing to your name. But as you'll see, this does vary by space. First of all, anywhere there's an NPC station, you have an option to truly guarantee the safety of your assets, so that's Highsec, Lowsec, and NPC Nullsec. Not quite every system has an NPC station, but in these areas of space they are not hard to find. Anything placed in your personal hangar in one of these stations cannot be destroyed by another player. It's for that reason that NPC stations are often the destination for recovered assets that were previously held in player-owned stations where asset safety starts to kick in. Once a player-owned structure is destroyed, the asset safety options will become available in your personal assets window. No matter the circumstances, these assets will be frozen for a minimum of 5 days, preventing alliances from holding a system indefinitely by anchoring new structures and immediately transferring all their assets ready for another defensive fight. Once that 5 days has concluded, you'll be able to select any other station in that system to deliver the items to. When the items are delivered to that structure, you simply dock in the structure and locate your asset safety container, then drag the items out of the container back into your hangar. There is a fee of 0.5% of the asset's value to make the recovery. This is a pretty low cost all things considered, so this is a perfect scenario. If, however, you do not have an accessible station in the same system, your wait increases from 5 days to 20 days, at which point you will not be given a choice about the destination, instead triggering a delivery of those items to a nearby NPC station in another system. How nearby will depend on your area of space, which is what we'll be looking at more closely. The price of recovery also rises tremendously from 0.5% to 15%, making full eviction from a system a much more expensive and inconvenient ordeal. Highsec is nice and straightforward. If your assets are in a player-owned station that is destroyed under regular circumstances of a Highsec war declaration or is unanchored by the owner, your assets will be transferred to an NPC station in the same system. If there is no NPC station in that system, it will be transferred to the nearest Highsec NPC station. Just note that this distance is not calculated by gate jumps, but by astronomical units. This can lead to surprises sometimes where your asset safety might end up in a system a few jumps away, despite there being an NPC station in the system next door. Highsec also has the benefit of being incredibly easy to evacuate. Just in case you don't want to wait that minimum 5 days or pay that asset recovery fee, you can move items manually out of one station and into another. If you're under war declaration, it would still take almost no time at all to train an alpha character in an NPC corporation into a tier 1 hauler and start moving the assets without the risk of war targets. There is the risk of ganking, but it's pretty much impossible to be ganked going from tether to tether or tether to NPC station, as long as you aren't just AFKing and drifting around in space for any length of time. If all that still sounds too risky, there are of course paid Highsec hauling services that may be able to help. Service to player-owned stations is definitely a bit rarer and more tricky than NPC stations, but there are in-game channels where you should be able to make a good arrangement with a hauler to help you out with a case like this. Your goods conveniently insured by the hauling contract's collateral, taking the risk out of the equation completely. Lowsec works very much the same way, but with the added benefit of jump freighters being a convenient option to extract items from player-owned stations prior to asset safety even kicking in. But just like Highsec, NPC stations are fairly prevalent in Lowsec, making in-system asset safety common and easy. Unlike Highsec asset safety, however, if there is no station in-system to transfer your assets to, the nearest NPC station that will be transferred to will always be another Lowsec NPC station. There will be no circumstance in which your asset safety gets moved from a Lowsec player-owned structure into a Highsec NPC station. This can make the logistics of extracting those assets later a bit more expensive. The closer you are to the borders with Highsec, the less this will impact you, but if you need to pay for someone's hauling services to achieve this, you'll find the price increases substantially in Lowsec compared to Highsec, due to the necessity of using jump freighters rather than regular freighters. Where things get a bit different is Nullsec. When assets are moved to asset safety from Nullsec and there's no accessible stations in the same system, they also always go to the nearest Lowsec NPC station by astronomical units. This can be a very, very long way, depending on where in Nullsec your items were. The effect of it being the nearest Lowsec station also means that asset safety is frequently consolidated to a few border systems in Lowsec, making it trivial for other groups to camp the asset safety station to disrupt attempts to extract the assets. Probably one of the most infamous examples of this is Mesaba, but anyone who was until recently in Pandemic Horde will be familiar with the Lowsec system Oderbine for the same reason. Wormholes are also in a very different position, but at least a simple one. There is no asset safety. That's it. If you have items in a station in a wormhole and that station dies, everything that was in your personal hangar will pop out into space in a container with your name on it. This is probably one of the most defining characteristics of wormhole space and something you should consider very closely before deciding to live there. EVE is ultimately a game about risk. It always has been, and along with risk comes a lot of fun and emergent stories. But if you expect to have long gaps between being able to play the game and hate the sound of having to rebuild from nothing, Wormholes might not be the place for you. There is of course a middle ground that you'll become more familiar with as you live there, with many assets safely stored in known space, but anything you bring into a wormhole with you is at risk of being lost completely without recovery. It would be remiss of me not to mention a couple of exceptions that you should keep in mind. In Highsec, Lowsec, Nullsec, anywhere in known space in EVE Online, if a structure is allowed to go abandoned, then its asset safety mechanics become the same as a wormhole. To go abandoned, a structure needs to run out of fuel and stay that way for 7 full days. After that point, if it's destroyed, all your stuff will pop out into space. If you ever get involved in a war and your opponents offer to buy a structure that they had intended to destroy for a suspiciously good price, keep in mind that's probably what they plan to do with it. Rather than just scoop up a relatively inexpensive structure core, they would like to let the structure go abandoned and scavenge the assets of your members who are not able to extract their stuff or trigger asset safety manually. Industry jobs that are completed but not delivered are also exempt from asset safety, so if you stick your best capital BPO to research and then go on a year-long break from EVE, don't be surprised if that's missing from your recovered assets when you come back. Diplomacy and culture are very vague concepts to base an entire section of this video around, and yet they are very necessary to keep in mind when considering the space in New Eden. The entire atmosphere, pun not intended, of a given area of space will vary significantly depending on its security status, because of the types of players that space will typically appeal to. We'll start off then with Sovereign Nullsec, because this one's the quickest to get out of the way. Short and sweet, Sovereign Nullsec requires a significant amount of cooperation and coordination to hold any significant amount of space. The holding and managing of that space is a very active process, as well as a constant perception of activity being necessary to avoid any alliance or coalition sensing weakness. The structure of organizations out in Nullsec is that of a corporation, alliance, and coalition, each being a subset of the next. The coalition-style gameplay that is typical of EVE has been taking some blows this year, but that's less a sign of health and more indicative of existing coalitions growing further after the demise of large alliances. Not unique to Nullsec, but definitely worth mentioning here, is the slightly alternative organizational structure of SIGs, or Special Interest Groups. Sometimes, rather than grouping together players by corporation, alliances prefer to greatly homogenize, or even assimilate member corporations into a single pool, then redistribute them into special interest groups selected by each player. The unique characteristic of a SIG, unlike a corporation, is that it's possible to be a member of and active within many rather than just one. The self-selection element also takes a lot of pressure off those in leadership positions to steer corporations in a specific direction culturally, instead allowing people to find the things that interest them most and participate in them through their own motivation. Each alliance in Nullsec is quite unique in its culture, but you can mostly imagine it on a sliding scale between the more militaristic alliances and the more economic alliances. I'm not going to try and assign a label to any of the alliances in Nullsec on that scale because it will turn my comment section into a war zone, but this is the scale you should keep in mind when researching who to join. It's also not a static measurement too, so if you've been in Nullsec for a while, you'll probably be able to pinpoint different times that your alliance was at different points on that scale. Lowsec has, at least on paper, a very similar structure. However, the coalitions are considerably more fluid and hard to define. One of my long-term video projects has been to make something a bit similar to the Nullsec Sov map, but for Lowsec, using a combination of upwell structures, Z killboard activity, and mapping out de facto zones of control. I think it's doable, but the challenge comes from this fluidity in relationships between different groups. It's not uncommon at all in Lowsec to be helping an alliance one day and fighting them the next. The presence of NPC stations and no solve mechanics means you can never truly be evicted from the space, allowing for a more risky and aggressive diplomacy and minimizing the need to rely on others for support. This also leads to people living in one specific region of Lowsec for a very, very long time, regardless of the major powers in the area, since you cannot force someone out of an NPC station. So if you hold grudges, Lowsec probably isn't for you. But if you like the freedom to get involved in almost any content in New Eden without needing an extensive defensive strategy, then it might be a good fit. The best part, of course, is that there's nothing stopping you from trying it out. You can go there right now with no membership necessary and get a feel for a region and the gameplay opportunities available there. Highsec is the only area of space in which you need to formally declare a war in order to shoot each other, without Concord intervention at least. On paper, this mechanic is primarily to avoid structure spam in Highsec, as well as disrupt the logistics of alliances that reside elsewhere in New Eden, but require access to Highsec for its trade hubs. In reality though, it's just really broken. Highsec war declaration mechanics are exploited pretty much every day, and CCP seems unable to work out an effective solution. Depending on who in the CCP team you ask, there's confusion as to whether these problems actually exist, an acknowledgement of the problems but a frustration at the complexities involved in fixing them, or even reassurance that everything is working exactly as intended. I will give them credit though, the EVE Online player base is deservedly known for finding the loophole in almost any mechanic, and it's tough to make something completely watertight. In this way, Highsec has forgiving consequences but far from forgiving circumstances. Ganking is a risk, not nearly as big a risk as you see people say it is, but it's something to keep in mind. Corporations and alliances in Highsec are rarely cooperative or social because there's very little need to be, and instead groups are usually quite insular. Bonds are built through adversity, and this is something that Highsec often lacks. I don't say this to discourage participation in Highsec corporations, because there definitely are many exceptions to this rule, but this is the space where you have the least exposure to much of the magic that makes EVE so special in comparison to any other MMO, or even any other game. I'd say at least that if you do want to live in Highsec, have it in your mind to try somewhere else too at some point. If you don't like it, you can always come back, and maybe that would be the place for you, but don't become one of the substantial population of EVE who start in Highsec and never even try to leave, who are barely skimming the surface of what the game has to offer. Wormhole space is, as always, the space I'm least qualified to talk about, but it's probably most similar to Lowsec out of the other three areas of space. Eviction is a much more important topic there given how the asset safety system works, but the low population of wormholes makes its corporations and alliances hungry for any content they can get their hands on. This necessitates that more fluid diplomatic relationships between groups happen, where you could be enemies one day and allies the next. Wormholes being so geographically varied, depending on the statics that are typical in your chain and what class of wormhole you live in, means that a lot of other spaces' content is available to you should you choose. Wormhole groups are notorious nullsec hunters, particularly for whaling fleets, where they can take advantage of the element of surprise and their unique connectivity to circumvent nullsec's usually powerful defensive tool, the intel channel. The low population of wormhole space also puts a significant amount of emphasis on respect between individuals and groups. EVE has a reputation for feeling like three people in a trench coat sometimes, with how often you start to spot the same people all over the place the more often you play. But wormhole space experiences this even more. If you're a bit of a hothead or troll, you'll fast find yourself unwelcome in most of the significant wormhole communities. How you travel around different spaces in EVE is, I think, an incredibly underrepresented aspect of life in each of those spaces. No matter what activities you're involved in, aside from I guess station trading, you will need to be traveling around. If someone can prevent you traveling, they can pretty much prevent you from playing the game at all, so it's important to be aware of the differences. In Highsec, you're relatively safe to travel almost anywhere. In fact, it has a lot more to do with the ship you're traveling in and the cargo you're carrying, rather than the route you decide to traverse. Get in a frigate or destroyer with an empty hold, and you could autopilot your way to almost any system in Highsec with your route settings on safe, and you'd come back later successfully in your destination. Ships designated for carrying high volumes of cargo will see increased attention from gankers at various choke points between trade hubs, but even this you can push up to a certain limit before really having to worry too much. The closer you are to a trade hub, certainly the more populous and sketchy an area will be. Flying around a couple of jumps away from Jita and somewhere deep in Minmatar space are not even slightly comparable experiences. A lot of people will talk about griefing in Highsec, and if you look closely enough, they are almost always people that don't stray more than a few jumps from Jita. Look into further fields and you'll find things considerably more tranquil. You cannot jump into Highsec with jump drive capable ships, so your only means of getting around is going through jump gates or wormholes, which for the most part will have their own section. There are however wormholes that go from known space to known space rather than actually traversing any wormhole space at all, including wormholes that go from Highsec to Highsec. So that is one much more rare means of travelling around the space. Now I have to admit my biases right away. Lowsec is my absolute favourite when it comes to travelling. Your mind is probably going to gate camps, but this is insanely easy to avoid. The problem is that most people's first exposure to Lowsec these days is Abazon, where dozens of pilots will be sat on gate ready and waiting to catch you during peak times of the day. In contrast, it's very unlikely you're going to bump into a gate camp like this in many other places in Lowsec. Learning to cloak trick is a big deciding factor in your ability to travel through Lowsec, but that's kind of getting ahead of myself. In Lowsec, gates are still your primary means of travel, with wormholes being a rare option, and the addition of jump drive capable ships being able to both jump from and to Lowsec. However, unlike Highsec, there is of course no Concord to punish combat, but there are gate guns. Gate guns in EVE are widely misunderstood by a lot of players in my experience, but if you live for any considerable length of time in Lowsec, you're going to be forced to learn their intricacies, because you will rely on them both for safe travel and any PvP that happens within their range. For starters, gate guns are pretty tough on a small ship like a frigate, destroyer, or cruiser, but once you get into the battle cruiser size and up, they become much less of a threat. This is especially the case if there are multiple ships fighting on grid, as gate guns will cycle through eligible targets periodically rather than just grinding away at one ship. You can also completely reset gate gun aggression by warping off out of the gun's range and then back down to the gate. You're then able to continue shooting the same target without the gate guns ever re-aggressing you. This is why places like Abazon can be so dangerous. All it takes is one or two ships to live long enough for the rest of the fleet to warp off and back, and then swap out with the original tacklers, and suddenly the gate guns become a complete non-issue. The gate guns do not trigger for PvP that would not have triggered a suspect flag. For example, returning fire against an aggressor, shooting a suspect or criminal, or shooting an eligible war target. All do not trigger response of the gate guns. It can take a bit of practice to get familiar with the different conditions that might apply while PvPing on grid with gate guns, but once you've mastered it, it can give you an upper hand that the less informed enemy won't anticipate. Lowsec gates, as with any gates, are affected by weapons timers. By this I mean those who've recently engaged in combat with another Capsuleer will be unable to jump through the gate until their weapons timer has expired. This can make or break travel survivability in Lowsec, so it's vital you understand how this works. Anytime you jump through a gate and are faced with a neutral pilot, you need to make a quick assessment as to whether your best course of action is to return fire and forfeit your ability to escape, or to burn back to the gate without retaliating, safe in the knowledge that if you make it through the gate, your opponent cannot follow. This is of course why it's also common for gate campers to split the fleet to both sides of the gate so that there's no escape by this means. Because of these factors, Lowsec travel is trivial in a small ship. For those unaware, in order for an aggressor to tackle you and prevent you from warping away from the gate, they must first lock you. The basic rule of thumb is that small ships take longer to be locked but lock other ships faster. For example, a frigate will lock a battleship very fast, while a battleship will take a long time to lock another frigate. Being in a small ship is therefore very safe, and there are a few ships like the Venture, most tier 3 destroyers in propulsion mode, and shuttles that will be nearly impossible to catch on a gate unless you fall asleep on the keyboard. Similarly, your opponent will usually be in a comparatively small ship in order to have any hope of locking you in time, or a larger ship with a very locking specialized fit. For example, I've always used a Gnosis with triple sensor boosters and information command burst. This is usually capable of catching any cruiser or larger ship, but smaller, even more specialized options will be necessary for catching destroyers and frigates. It would follow logically that flying a large ship would be more dangerous, and it is, but it can be done safely too. This is where that cloak trick I mentioned comes in. There are much better videos out there that will tell you exactly how to pull this off, but to explain it simply, your ship warps when it reaches 70% of its top speed and is aligned in the direction of travel. When you jump through a gate, you are stationary, meaning you have no alignment, and will therefore align instantly to anything. Even if you might visually appear to be turning, you are, as far as the game's mechanics are concerned, completely aligned instantaneously. This is what causes the funny phenomenon of ships warping off gates sideways sometimes. So if it takes longer than the cycle time of your propulsion module to get up to 70% speed normally, doing just one cycle of that propulsion module can get you into warp faster. Now if you combine this with an improved cloak, the real magic happens. You align to the object you want to warp to, while pressing both your cloak and propulsion module buttons simultaneously, then you turn off the propulsion module, and just as it's coming to the end of its cycle, you also turn off your cloak and spam the warp button. This will take plenty of practice, but once mastered, it will make even the largest of ships very difficult to catch. This, by the way, is why you'll often see gate campers orbiting the gate at 15 kilometers with their drones out and maybe even some cans in space. Your cloak module is unable to activate and will actually be deactivated if you get close to another entity in space, so this is an effort to prevent people from using this trick to bypass a gate camp. This trick is totally viable in all areas of space, by the way, but we'll see in a moment why it's not quite the foolproof effective strategy in Nullsec and Wormholes the way it is in Lowsec. Before we move on to those though, just one final mechanic that is present in Lowsec: smart bombing. Smart bombing is in Nullsec and Wormholes too, of course. There's a good chance if you follow a lot of EVE Online YouTube content, you'll have seen some of the videos of the infamous pipe bombing antics of Rooks and Kings. It's very prevalent in Lowsec though, as another form of gate camp, catching you when you arrive at a gate rather than when you leave. In a properly fitted ship or anything larger, it's not something you really need to worry about outside of extremely coordinated smart bombers like that which you would again find in somewhere like Abazon. However, if you travel around in a shuttle or pod, warping from gate to gate without bouncing off a celestial at a different angle can be a surefire way to lose your implants. Even a cheaply fit Praxis can destroy you on landing like this, and once you've clicked warp, your fate is already sealed. The major difference once you go into Nullsec and Wormholes is the bubble. Bubbles are technically possible in Lowsec too, I know, you can stop writing that comment. They can only be done in maximum corruption systems in faction warfare space, so it's far from common in Lowsec, but something to have in the back of your mind if one of the systems in your route guidance is a little triangle instead of a square, signifying one of those corrupted systems. The bubble is probably just as widely misunderstood as gate guns, but this graphic on screen explains things quite well. There are a lot of myths about how they work which propagate among players despite no basis in fact, so just refer back to this graphic if you ever get confused. The important thing about them when travelling though is that they are effective at both stopping you from warping off a gate and at stopping you from landing on the gate you're intending to warp to. Interdiction nullifiers are a module that can prevent their effectiveness, but even this only goes so far, as they must be activated at the right time, have a long cooldown, and are not eligible to be fit on every ship. This is why intel channels are so vital for travelling around Nullsec, and even with an active intel channel you can get caught off guard occasionally. Travelling around by jump drive then becomes an even more appealing option in Nullsec than it was in Lowsec. For a long time this meant using a jump freighter, maybe a Black Ops battleship and its compatible conduit cloakies, or if you were very lucky, your own Titan with which to bridge. But now CCP has added the ability to conduit regular subcapital combat ships with a carrier with relatively little skill. No special module is needed, and the actual jump portal skill is only necessary to increase the number of ships you can conduit. As long as you can sit in a carrier hull and have the appropriate jump skills to reach the destination cynosural field, you can conduit up to 5 ships, making this a very convenient way of getting around for more experienced players with some skill points under their belt and multiple characters. Nullsec's completely unique travel method is the Ansiblex jump gate, which for the most part functions as a player-owned gate. It does however have the unique characteristic that if you are tackled, you are unable to jump through the gate, regardless of weapons timers or any other eligibility. Whether or not you can jump through the Ansiblex is checked in the same way as whether or not you'd be able to warp away from it. Despite this drawback, Ansiblex present the unique ability to jump through a gate and not have your enemy follow behind you, as access to the gate is determined by an access list, much like an upwell structure. With a well-designed Ansiblex network, the distances you can travel in Nullsec in a short time frame can be astronomical compared to anywhere else in the game. Wormholes, of course, completely lack the ability to use a jump drive, both for jumping in or out of their space. However, the wormhole itself has many unique characteristics that affect travel. For example, combat timers are of no concern. You can shoot right up to the second that you jump through the wormhole with impunity, making fights where ships are jumping back and forth quite common, but that's where polarization comes in. You can only jump through the same side of a wormhole once every 5 minutes. You could jump from System A into System B, and then immediately back from System B into System A, but to go from A to B again, you first need to wait for a polarization timer. This can lead to a bit of bluffing during fights on whether you're going to burn back towards the wormhole or warp off, and significantly turn the tide of fights if unpolarized reinforcements show up, trapping a fleet on one side of the wormhole with no escape. I had intended to do a section here about PvP mechanics in each of those spaces, but honestly I think talking about travelling around in those spaces has really articulated how they differ in PvP quite well. But there is just one more thing that gets overlooked, primarily as a difference between Lowsec on one side, then Nullsec and Wormholes on the other side. That is, commitment. Committing to a fight and the ability to extract from one turning south is at the top of any fleet commander's mind. Combat and content in general is all fun and games, but feeding ships at an alliance level is expensive compared to whelping a small gang fleet, especially once you start getting to the bigger and more expensive ships like capitals and supercapitals. One of the reasons that you'll often see multiple trillion-esque fights taking place in Lowsec, while Nullsec numbers struggle to compete outside of some of the biggest era-defining fights, is commitment. A quick look through the EVE history books and the biggest battles of all time will show you the results of fights in which both sides decide to commit, and being involved in those is truly an intense and exhilarating experience worthy of the "I was there" moniker so frequently used in relation to events in EVE's history. Bubbles are the big culprit once again. In Lowsec, outside of those corrupted faction warfare bubbleable systems, extraction from a fight is usually simple. Very rarely are a majority of your ships going to be tackled on grid, and if that happens, you usually messed up your strategy way before it got to this point. Even a large Lowsec sub-capital fleet is likely to only have a handful of tackle ships, usually heavy interdictors, so enemy sub-capitals and capitals alike need only warp off or jump out of system respectively if the fight feels like it's going too poorly. This allows Lowsec alliances to commit considerable assets to achieving an objective, let's say destroying a structure, safer in the knowledge that once the objective is won, they can remove their ships from harm's way. This kind of reassurance does not exist in Nullsec or Wormholes thanks to the bubble. One extremely low-cost destroyer interdictor can trap entire fleets, from something as small as a gang of assault frigates all the way up to a full super capital fleet. Heavy interdictors are also able to use the bubble version of their high slot module here, making them an extremely tanky and mobile bubble in their own right, pursuing fleets or orbiting capitals, keeping them trapped on grid for as long as necessary. Even after an objective is complete, in these spaces, but especially Nullsec, it is viable to trap a fleet in position for potentially hours while organizing a reinforcement fleet capable of destroying the entire enemy force with ease. Sorry about the wait between my last video and this one. It takes considerably longer to script, revise, record, edit and re-edit these videos when you don't use AI to write your scripts and record your voiceovers, which seems to be taking EVE Online content on YouTube by storm. Are there any major differences between these areas of New Eden that you think I missed? Please do leave a comment below so that we can all learn something new. As always with EVE, you pretty much never stop learning. If you want to help support the channel, consider buying your next EVE Online pack, subscription, or Plex from marqueedragon.com using the link in the video description. Use coupon code BILL at checkout for 3% off your order. I've also got YouTube membership enabled now. I've only recently become eligible for it, but the plan is to include some member-only videos and probably a Discord server or something like that. The only perk for subscribing right now is a badge on YouTube, but it's 99 cents if you'd prefer that way of supporting the channel.